Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about bias, or more specifically, the effect of bias. I call this the death magnetic effect, and it is essentially where an observer is interpreting or even experiencing a piece of art as better than what it is because they're comparing it to what directly preceded it, either the previous movie in a movie series or the previous album by the same band, rather than applying a more generalized or more objective standard. This is a type of anchoring bias. We call it an anchoring bias because where you anchor your point of comparison drastically affects your quality assessment of something else. It's kind of like the old economist joke. How's your wife? Compared to what? Is this thing safe? Compared to what? Comparisons are very important. So in this case, you're anchoring your standard to the previous installment in a series rather than to sort of all things that you've experienced. And I named this effect after what I consider a really good example, which is Death Magnetic by Metallica. This is an album that came out in 2008 and followed a 2003 album by Metallica called Saint Anger. Saint Anger was pretty much universally reviled by the entire Metallica fan base and the entire metal fan base for sure. So when Death Magnetic arrived, it was considered this huge improvement. And everyone was started to say, Metallica's back. They came out with this new album. It's great. It's Death Magnetic. Even today, I still get all these comments when people get upset that I say Death Magnetic's a bad album. But it all depends on your point of comparison. If you're comparing it to Saint Anger, yes, it's a huge improvement. Saint Anger was bad and really bad in almost every way you can think of. The production, the songwriting, the lyrics, there's no guitar solos. Death Magnetic's a big improvement. The production is really bad on Death Magnetic. And that's not the only reason I dislike it, because years later I've heard fan remakes of the same songs where they got rid of like this ultra thin, super maximized farty guitars and put good guitar tone or good vocal tone, and they're not good songs. And the guitar solos in particular I find really bad on Death Magnetic. But what do I compare Death Magnetic to? Well, I compare it to my entire experience of the genre of metal. So if your standard is all metal, Death Magnetic is pretty low. Yeah, it's better than Saint Anger, but it's pretty bad in general. I did this just to see what came out in 2008. I don't remember. So I typed in metal albums 2008 in Google, and you see a big list of them. I had to go pretty deep down that list to find any album that was actually better than Death Magnetic. Another album where I could put that anchoring point on it and say that Death Magnetic was a good album. There was a huge number of great albums released in 2008. So your point of comparison really matters. If you're comparing Death Magnetic to Saint Anger, yes, Death Magnetic's a good album. If you're comparing Death Magnetic to Watershed by Opeth, which came out in 2008, Death Magnetic's a terrible album. And in fact, when you take the entire genre as a whole during 2008, you see that Death Magnetic is really quite bad. If you were to set your generalized standard to be, say, all Metallica albums, you'd probably end up, if you're being really, really serious, you'd probably end up saying, yeah, it's still a pretty bad album. It's like, is it better than the first five? It's like, no, it's infinitely worse than them. That's what most fans that I know think of. And in fact, most people I know that listen to metal in general had the same opinion of Death Magnetic as me, or a similar opinion, which is that it was not a very good album. It was mediocre to bad. But it was better than Saint Anger, so it was a positive move for the band, and that's appreciated. But to then say that the album is good is not correct. Now you could rename this after a million different versions of this, right? So you could call this the Episode 3 effect, the Revenge of the Sith effect, where Revenge of the Sith, the third Star Wars prequel, was seemingly such an improvement over Attack of the Clones, Episode 2, that you interpret Episode 3 as being a good movie. But when you sort of generalize your comparison even to all Star Wars movies, you realize it's still really not that good of a movie. It's got a lot of flaws. It's got a lot of problems. It's not as good as people seem to think it, and so you can make this with a bunch of different things as well. So anyway, I thought I would talk about that one because it's everywhere. What you're comparing something to really does matter, and it can even, in my experience or in my opinion, it does affect people's experience of what they're seeing. If you watched a really bad movie and something significantly better while you're watching the better movie, you're going to say this movie's great. Even though if you were to compare it to something that is more generally good, you might not have that particular opinion. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And Get on my mailing list. I have a new book coming out. It's called Needle Ash. And if you get on my mailing list, you're going to get the book for free. And I will talk about in future videos how I'm going to release that. It's called Needle Ash. It is a high fantasy book. It is technically a sequel to Water of Awakening, but you don't have to have read Water of Awakening to get that. So I'll see you guys next time and have a great one. Let me know what you think about the death magnetic effect down below.